Join the most innovative and passionate education community at South by Southwest EDU 2023. Take part in impactful community-driven programming, unparalleled networking opportunities, and unexpected discoveries, March 6th through 9th, 2023 in Austin, Texas. Visit southbysouthwestedu.com to discover more than 200 sessions already revealed, featuring inspiring thought leaders in education. Register today. This is EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavita Cardoza. I'm delighted to chat with Madeline Will, who covers teaching, and Arianna Prothero, who covers student well-being and technology. They're both longtime education reporters at Education Week. Madeline and Arianna have just completed their EWA fellowship. It's a series about climate change and education. Thank you both for making the time.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Vita.
Several states saw record-breaking temperatures this year. You'll report that schools across the country, including Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cleveland, Denver, and San Diego, closed because of excessive heat. And in Columbus, Ohio, teachers went on strike demanding air conditioning in their classrooms. This is part of what makes education reporting so interesting to me. The breadth of topics we cover, like it's virtually everything. Almost anything that happens nationally or internationally eventually plays out in schools. How did you come up with this idea?
For me, at least, climate change always felt like a science story. And then I think over the past couple years, we've increasingly noticed that it's become an education story too, that these natural disasters and excessive heat are really impacting schools and students. And we wanted to explore what exactly that meant.
Climate change is also something of such high interest to the students we cover. I mean, it is such an energizing and motivating cause for them. And it's something that, as we've seen through climate protests, as we've seen through activism, an area where they are not only making change happen, but an area that can really bring them into school and bring them and engage them in their education.
So typically we think of summers as being really hot, right? And schools are closed during summer.
Yeah, but we've noticed, or I guess scientists have noticed, that the summer is getting longer. It's becoming more hot, and a lot of schools were not really prepared for that. A lot of schools in the Northeast and East Coast don't have adequate air conditioning because they didn't really need it up until now. But now we're starting to see these hot temperatures extend into the start of the school year. And research shows that can have detrimental effects on student learning and well-being.
So when you say excessive heat, is there kind of a cutoff temperature that researchers are talking about? And which parts of the country are most at risk?
So researchers say 80 degrees is kind of the point where it's excessive heat, where if the school does not have air conditioning and it's 80 degrees outside, the students will be uncomfortable inside. They won't be able to focus as well on tests, and that's just not ideal for anybody. One researcher told me that in the past, you could draw a line across the United States that would go from Washington, D.C. all the way to Southern California. And you would be able to expect that everywhere south of that line would have the appropriate air conditioning systems in their school. But over the past few decades, that line has moved up. So now it passes from Philadelphia through Cleveland and Chicago, and schools in those regions don't have air conditioning yet because they hadn't needed it up until this point.
This is such an interesting topic for me, Arianna and Maddie, because I grew up in India and we didn't have air conditioning at school. We just had fans. And I still remember in the afternoons kind of feeling really sleepy. But now there's evidence that heat affects student learning, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, student learning and well-being in ways that are much more serious than just dozing off, right?
Well, I think dozing off is a big part of it too. The research has found that students perform worse on tests when it's hot outside. That's, in part because they're having a hard time concentrating, they're getting sleepy, they're not paying attention as well as they could to the lessons and to the test. But we also see, doctors have said that in those areas, there might be students who don't have air conditioning at home. And when it's hot, they don't get a good night's sleep. And that also affects learning. Hot temperatures can also kind of muddle students' thinking and they might act out in class. Nobody's really at their best when it's so hot outside. Football players, we know that they're at risk for heat-related illness. Some high school players have died from heat stroke from practices and games. We also see cross-country runners and anybody who practices outside, especially in states that haven't previously experienced these dramatic heat waves. They might not have the protocols in place for heat safety. Maybe Texas, they might have more of a experience with students practicing in hot temperatures, but maybe Massachusetts might not. So I think a lot of advocates are saying that some states are just not prepared for the hot temperatures when it comes to student athletes.
Mm-hmm. Buildings in traditionally hot countries are often designed for cross ventilation and to maximize breeze. But here, a lot of buildings are constructed to keep in the heat, right? Because they're not used to needing air conditioning, like you said. And we know we have a lot of older school buildings. So how are states preparing? And most importantly, what is it going to cost?
I thought it was so interesting that just black rubber just traps in the heat, or metal playground equipment can be dangerous when it's so hot outside. And a lot of schools still have that. I don't think many schools are preparing to replace all of that. So, advocates have said that they hope to work with schools and states so that when districts are ready to revamp, they will choose materials and infrastructure design choices that kind of make more sense in hotter temperatures. But it is a costly step for something that people might think, oh, well, this is only happening for a month or so in the school year. But I think the concern is that it will continue to become hotter and hotter.
Has there been any kind of ballpark figure on what it might cost?
One expert told me that installing air conditioning in all the schools that need it would cost up to tens of billions of dollars. So it's a lot of money. The pandemic relief money from the federal government could be used to install or upgrade air conditioning units. But the experts I spoke to said that won't come close to fully solving the problem, and that policymakers are really going to need to continue to invest in this in the years to come.
And with so many kids kind of having fallen behind during the pandemic, it doesn't sound like air conditioning is something people are going to be pushing for.
Right. I think it's an easy problem to kind of kick down the road, but experts are worried because we are seeing schools close due to extreme heat because it's too hot for kids to be comfortably in school, and that adds up to disruptions in learning time.
Mm-hmm. What would be a good starting point for a reporter who wants to cover this issue?
I think it would be interesting to look at how average temperatures have changed in your community over the past few decades and see if the schools that you cover have air conditioning and have proper air conditioning, and if they've had to close for heat. And if not, if they don't have that air conditioning, it would be interesting to see what the plans are, if any, or if this is not really on district leaders' radar.
Mm-hmm. To add to that last question you just asked, how climate change affects a community really varies from area to area. So this is really at its heart a very local story. So I would encourage anyone wanting to jump into this to look around your community and see what has been happening so far. Has it been increased flooding? Has it been increased heat? Has it been more severe storms? Has it been more tornadoes? And start from there, because that's a way to make what you're doing and what you're covering and what you're writing about more tangible and more real to your readers in your area. And even as a national reporter, tying it to what people are seeing on the ground in specific regions, I think is really helpful.
Both of you have included a lot of examples of organizations that study the intersection between education and climate. Undaunted, K-12, Center for Climate Health and Global Environment, the Center for Evaluation and Education Policy Analysis. I wanted to add the K-12 Climate Action Commission. Are there any other resources you would point to?
Yeah, I would say, NASA and NOAA, two federal agencies, are great sources of information on climate change.
No other National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, right?
Absolutely, that's the one. And it's really easily digestible information. And they also have a lot of resources that are geared more towards kids, which it can also be helpful to a reporter when you're trying to understand something complicated.
Yep.
The Aspen Institute has a branch or an initiative on K-12 schools and climate change. And I recently learned of a organization called Subject to Climate that actually provides a lot of resources to teachers on teaching climate change. And I found that to be a really helpful resource so far.
I would also add the Climate Mental Health Network is doing some work with educators and looking at how climate change can affect students' mental health, whether they're experiencing anxiety or other distress about the environment. They're doing some interesting work around this subject.
As part of your project, both of you also had a research survey done on this issue. Tell me a little bit about it and what did you find?
Well, we asked teenagers and specifically high school students a range of questions about climate change. So this really went from the basic question, do you believe climate change is happening and is primarily driven by human action? And then we asked questions that kind of dove into their understanding a bit more. So asked them what causes climate change. Is it fossil fuels? Is it sun flares? To kind of gauge their understanding of the science behind it. So you can say that, yes, I believe in this, but do you really understand the underlying causes of it?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer was, it was really mixed on that one. We asked students, where do they get information on climate change? What are their primary sources of information? And to that, they said teachers first, parents a close second, and then third, social media. We asked them how it made them feel, if they felt hopeful, if they felt despair, and a whole range of issues around that. And we asked them questions about what kind of action they're taking in their lives to address climate change, whether it's recycling or turning off lights, all the way to walking out of school and participating in large-scale protests.
This was clearly a top-of-mind issue, I think, for the teenagers.
One thing that jumped out to Maddie and I was the fact that so many teenagers wanted to learn more about climate change in school, that there is this real hunger to learn more about it when we know that it's not comprehensively taught in a lot of states or not required to be taught by a lot of states.
I was going to ask you all about curriculum, like what have you found?
We didn't ask in the survey a lot of detailed questions around curriculum, but what I found from talking to high school students is that it's really a mixed bag. There are certainly schools that are teaching this in a more comprehensive way. We talked to students in New Jersey where climate change is now required to be taught as of this year in every subject, in every grade. It's supposed to be addressed. And then there are a lot of students that, maybe it was mentioned once in a science class in middle school and that was about it. And they really have gotten a lot of their information on climate change from parents and from social media and from just searching on their own. And often we're inspired by seeing actual climate change or the effects of climate change in their community, say like a wildfire. I've talked to a couple students who really got interested in learning more about climate change and taking action and advocating around climate change because of wildfires. And I think one other interesting takeaway that I had was when we first looked at the survey data, it showed that teachers were the most cited source of information for students. And I thought, well, that makes sense. Of course, they're learning about it in school. But as I've talked to students, what I seem to have found is that they're not learning about climate change necessarily from, say, their science teachers in science class. They're not learning a whole lot about climate change from sort of traditional instruction in school, but they're learning about it through climate change clubs. So maybe they aren't learning a lot from their science teacher, but they're actually learning a lot from, say, the art teacher who's heavily involved in the school's environmental club. So I thought it was interesting that even when they're learning from teachers, it seems, and the students I talked to were not a representative sample, that they're still learning about climate change from their teachers in an informal way versus a more formal curriculum.
That feels kind of depressing.
Yeah, you could say that.
Or maybe someone who sees the glass half full would say, well, they're still learning it, so it's hopeful.
One thing that the National Center for Science Education has said is that most teachers just don't have any training to talk about climate change. They haven't taken any classes in their teacher prep programs or don't have any PD about it. And so a lot of teachers feel like out of their depth, and students have a lot of questions, which I think we found in our survey. So there's a curriculum question, but there's also the teacher preparation question. Are teachers even ready to talk about this, especially, considering that it can be controversial?
And I just wanted to add, not just controversial, but also complicated. Mm-hmm. It's a tough topic.
What is so interesting to me is, as someone who doesn't have children in the school system, I just assumed that the opposite would be true, where children were being taught so much about climate change, like they would have climate fatigue almost. It hadn't occurred to me that the opposite was true, where they really were learning hardly anything.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of hard to say, because I think if you're a student who's interested in this, you can get information in school from it. I mean, whether it's through an environmental club, whether it's getting involved in extracurriculars, or you might have a social studies teacher that's really interested in connecting you to climate change advocacy organizations to sort of help teach those civic engagement skills. I think that is a reality in several schools, or many schools, that if you're interested, there are means to get information. But yeah, and in terms of, is everyone just learning this like they're learning other basic skills or topics? I think the answer, and maybe Maddie wants to jump in on this, I think the answer is not necessarily.
It could be that it was interesting that you had said, maybe there's climate fatigue because it's just like such a heavy topic in the news. And I thought that might be the case as well. But when we asked teenagers, when you think about climate change, what do you feel? Only 7% said they were uninterested. So
wow.
Teenagers have strong emotions about this, and they are curious.
I think we've both spoken to teachers who really worry about depressing kids and not knowing how to tackle this topic without making them feel really despondent or sad or hopeless. And so that's another thing that teachers are really trying to figure out how to navigate.
Mm-hmm. This kind of goes back to the mental health piece of climate change.
Yeah, and that's a big issue. Over a third, 37% of teens said they felt anxious when they thought about climate change. A large number also said they felt afraid, helpless, overwhelmed. I spoke to a lot of experts about how teachers could kind of mitigate those feelings. And their consensus was that it could help if teachers just make space for teens to talk about this, especially with people who feel similarly to them. Validate what they're feeling. Don't just dismiss it. Let them talk about it. And also show them, what they can maybe do on their own to feel like they're making a difference in their own community. See the good that's happening too, because sometimes when you look at the facts, it can feel very scary. But there can be signs of progress as well.
I wanted to ask you something that a lot of reporters struggle with, especially doing this remotely. How did you find students?
I found students through asking teachers. I had a couple of teachers that I knew that I reached out to and asked if they could connect me with any students in their class who might be thinking about this. I wanted to talk to people who might not be the outspoken advocates, the kind of activists that make the headlines, but just the more typical high school student who has thoughts but hasn't really gotten involved on a larger scale. And one resource I've found to be very helpful is going through State Teachers of the Year. They are usually willing to speak to the media because they've been interviewed a lot. And, there's a list of them on CCSSO's website. And you can see which teachers are teaching like science and reach out to them that way. And I was able to get connected to students through them.
I have to say, I've had good luck with Teachers of the Year as well, especially when it's a really difficult topic. It's like they feel empowered to speak about it because no one's going to say, well, they're a terrible teacher, and so they're just blaming this or that. You know what I mean? They're Teacher of the Year, and so they've got some kind of shield. Do you have anything to add, Arianna?
Yeah, no, I think climate change is one of those things where there are a lot of activist organizations. So you can find some smaller ones that can connect you to students, but you are more likely to interview students who have appeared in other media outlets. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if they're doing, if what they're doing relates to your story. I would found so something I have to say, this is always like the biggest challenge for me when I'm writing is finding students when you're a national reporter to talk to. So I'm always looking for hacks and tricks to do this. And one thing that I've did this time that I've never done before was I actually started looking up just Googling like awards and recognitions. I wanted to interview students specifically in New Jersey because they had just started teaching climate change in all grades and in all subjects. And I started looking up awards and recognitions and found some students that had been recognized by the governor's wife for actions they had taken in their school related to climate change and sustainability, and was able to just call those schools and say, I want to talk to these students. And of course, they're more than happy to connect me with the students because they're proud of them. I think also contacting national charter school networks like KIPP is a good tactic. They have, savvy communication teams that are pretty good at getting you connected to students. So that's another route you can try.
Were there any challenges in reporting this piece?
Well, personally, for me, the biggest challenge is trying to find students. That took up 90% of my reporting time.
And I think one of the challenges is really thinking of ways to have this topic resonate with readers. It's a hard topic, and a lot of people just don't want to read about climate change for understandable reasons. And it's not as splashy as some of the other news stories we write about. I wrote this story about how teens were struggling with climate anxiety. And then I wrote another piece using kind of some of the same information with a headline, 5 ways that educators can help students who have climate anxiety. And just a kind of a more optimistic, a more solutions-focused way of looking at the same issue. And so the hope is that one of those 2 angles might appeal to readers. So we'll see which one does better.
Yeah, I feel like climate change it's weird to say this, sometimes feels like such an undercovered issue, even though there is tons of coverage on it. It just feels undercovered in relationship to the severity and size of the problem. And it's the same issue anybody, scientists, activists, anybody deals with in climate change is it's not necessarily barreling down on people right now in the same way that maybe inflation is. And it's hard to compete for people's attention.
My guests are Madeline Will and Arianna Prothero. They've just completed a series on climate change and education. You can follow them on Twitter at Madeline_Will and at Arianna Prothero on Twitter. You can also read their work in Education Week. Thank you both for making the time to chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavita Cardoza. Do you have any questions for Madeline and Arianna? Let's continue the conversation on Twitter at EdWriters. Special thanks to Angelina Liu and Kristan Obang from EWA, as well as Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism. Join the most innovative and passionate education community at South by Southwest EDU 2023. Take part in impactful community-driven programming, unparalleled networking opportunities, and unexpected discoveries, March 6th through 9th, 2023 in Austin, Texas. Visit southbysouthwestedu.com to discover more than 200 sessions already revealed, featuring inspiring thought leaders in education. Register today.